Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Mayflower Hotel in downtown Washington, where we're covering the Center for a New American Security's annual conference. This year's topic, Navigating the Divide in National Security. And we have with us Julie Smith, who is the Director of the Transatlantic Security Program at CNAS. You're also somebody who has more than a passing interest in Russia and a former National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. So your panel kicked off the discussion. Very, very interesting, and also somewhat downbeat on the prospects for Europe and for the future of the transatlantic relationship. Talk to us about how you gauge that. You have been critical of the president and some of the rhetoric that he's made. You engage a lot with our European allies on a very regular basis, and you watch Russia as well. What were some of your takeaways, and why are you somewhat more optimistic than perhaps Bob Kagan on the panel, who talked about the canary the transatlantic canary is dead?
Well, I do think the transatlantic partners have a lot of challenges to deal with right now. We have publics on both sides of the Atlantic that are losing faith in the institutions that make up the transatlantic relationship. So loss of faith in the ability of the EU to respond to citizens' needs, some questions about NATO's utility. What is it doing? Is it fighting terrorism? But we also have an external actor in Russia that's actively working to undermine the rules-based system and the liberal order. And Russia is injecting itself into the political processes in Europe, and as we saw in the United States as well. And then there's just a whole array of challenges for which these institutions are not really prepared. So neither the EU nor NATO really know what to do about cyber. They don't know what to do exactly about disinformation campaigns or energy coercion. They're working on it. They've developed some new policies. But my takeaway this morning was really, we've got a lot of work to do. And unfortunately right now, both sides are kind of distracted. We've got partisan politics here, an administration that's still ramping up, trying to get people into their seats, a little bit uncertain about where they want to take the transatlantic relationship. And the Europeans are also distracted. They're consumed with Brexit and kind of where that's going to take them. So I really think we've got to do less navel gazing and kind of look out and start a new agenda that will include new capabilities and new tools to deal with some of these new threats.
What do you think is our European allies are concerned a little bit about the rhetoric. Folks were concerned about the president not invoking Article 5 himself when he was at the dedication of the Article 5 memorial. He was meeting with Romania's president and did finally say that, and that was received positively by some, but we were just in Europe, and folks were saying, look, just mentioning it once does not overcome the consistent resistance to wanting to give that endorsement to the transatlantic alliance fundamentally. Do you think that there is a wider danger to that core strategic relationship? Admiral Michael Mullen was former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was at CSIS, was speaking there, and he said, look, these nations in Europe are our very closest allies. It's not the folks in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere in the world. These are our closest, democratic, common heritage, whole bunch of things that makes these our closest friends. And his concern was that the time that if there's a split that develops, in short order, that could become a wider rift that becomes harder to bridge over time. Is that something that you're concerned about?
I am concerned about that. I mean, I don't want to have a period in time where Europe and the United States are at odds with one another, given everything that Russia's trying to do right now to divide Europe from within and divide Europe from the United States. I would hate to see Putin accomplish those goals. Right now, I really would like to see the president reaffirm those common values. I think the trip to Poland, I hope next week, that's coming up on the margins of the G20 will be a good one, that he can kind of right-set some of what went wrong in this first visit to Europe. And I also hope that the G20 meeting will give him an opportunity to, again, have a closer relationship with our European allies. We can't afford to have a sour relationship with these guys. There's too much at stake. And when a crisis erupts, the place that we're going to turn is going to be Europe. Those are the allies. It's an imperfect relationship, but it's the best one we have.
Does the president's popularity or lack of it, given the new Pew poll that just came out, make it harder for European leaders to make available troops or any of the big, you guys talked a little bit about big asks. We were just over at NATO and spoke to Rose Gadamuller, the Deputy Secretary General. She said that for the time being, it's not on the table for more combat troops to be going to Afghanistan, but I know that some of the administration would like to make that ask of countries. Does the popularity of the American president reflect in the ability of national leaders to do what it is we'd like them to do?
Well, I do think there's truth to the old adage about, all politics is personal. I really do think that personal relationships matter, and if the president finds himself in a situation where he's going to need to be asking our European allies to do more of something, and it can be anything, it doesn't have to be Afghanistan, but if that ask is going to be made by the president, it helps to have a positive relationship with European allies. And right now, unfortunately, he hasn't either met with some of the European allies, hasn't developed close relationships, or worse, is calling them out by name and really personally attacking them. So that friction could end up being counterproductive when he needs them in a crisis. And I hope over time, again, he'll have more of an appreciation of how much this relationship matters. But right now there is, as you picked up, some uncertainty out there in Europe about what his intentions are and where he wants to take the relationship.
The president has not yet, or the administration hasn't articulated a Russia approach or strategy. Understandably, there's an investigation and talk about Russia's involvement in the elections that's taken a lot of oxygen out of the room. What is the approach the United States and this new administration has to take with Russia? What are some of the messages you think the president has to be delivering to Vladimir Putin when they meet on the sidelines of the G20?
I think I support the president in the sense that he wants to engage with the Russians, and we have to do that. We can't kid ourselves and assume that we can just completely turn the lights out. On the other hand, we have to be cautious and we have to be careful about the ways in which we engage the Russian president. In particular, I think we have to be careful about giving away too much without proof of a real change in Russian policy. So I would want to see them have a conversation. I would not want to see the president, for example, return the 2 compounds that were taken away from Russia in the wake of their interference in our election, unless we had a guarantee change in their approach to Ukraine or some other crisis in the world where we felt like we were getting something in return. So with the Russians, it's really engage, but almost, distrust and verify. You want to make sure that we can hold them to their word and ensure that progress is going to be made. They have a tendency to promise you the moon and under-deliver, so I would caution this president not to fall into that trap.
Julie, thanks very, very much. Great conference.
My pleasure.